Fine. The next theme is from the Deputy Convener, Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. You'll be delighted to know that I'm going to go back to sustainable forest management. In section 9, it says that forestry land must be managed in a way that promotes sustainable forest management, whatever that means to certain individuals. Do you think that there are any differences on the ground that section 9 will make? And would you like to see any changes to it, or is it okay as it is?
I'm looking at you, Ian, as a practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does cover the and it's because it's, as I said, it's well understood. So I think that's adequate, and it shouldn't really change anything on the ground. But it's this. There's a concern, I think, that with the wider remit of the and it coming under the ministers, that sustainable development might trump sustainable forestry management, and I think that's a concern, because that could mean that deforestation takes place when there's for instance, a big financial incentive for that to occur. So there's a concern that the clear message of what the Commission has achieved over the years, and it's 100 years old nearly, that of focusing on forestry and really pushing that and being an advocate and a facilitator for forestry, will be lost because there's other things come in. So.
Stuart, do you want to add to that? And I know Gail's got a subsequent question there.
If I can do, Gail, you asked specifically about sustainable forest management and then sort of broader in section 9.3. And, I mean, in terms of sustainable forest management, the comments made previously, I mean, for me, sustainable forest management is a description of a process. It's how you produce an outcome. It's a balanced process, and therefore the outcome is intended to be what's appropriate for the local circumstance, because you've engaged with economic interests, social interests, environmental interests. So it's a flexible mechanism, but there's a lot of guidance which is helping you to achieve that outcome and what that means for forestry. So where it's referred, we're quite relaxed. But picking up on Ian's point, in section 9.3, which refers to land, as we describe it, owned and or managed by Scottish ministers, I'd say it's part of Part 3, and if Part 3 was designed to tie up Confor staff and trying to understand what it meant for ours, then Scottish Government officials have been incredibly successful. We think we've got our head round it, but really mainly because we've read the evidence that's been given and we've asked questions, and we think we're 95% of the way there. But on section 9.3, what we're concerned is that at the moment we would look at public forestry land, so the National Forest Estate plus land that's brought in, as being primarily there for forestry and managed for forestry purposes, for sustainable forestry purposes. And we're aware that the Scottish Minister, Simon Hodge, who runs National Forest Estate, would like to be able to use that land for wider purposes than just forestry. That's understood, and we recognise that 200,000 hectares of the National Forest Estate are not actually covering trees. There's 30,000 hectares of actively managed agricultural land. Therefore, it makes sense to say that that can be managed for a purpose other than sustainable forest management. But the way that it's drafted seems to imply that the forest land needn't be managed for sustainable forest management. The evidence given on June the 7th, I think it was by Carol Barker-Munro, said that the land could be managed for sustainable forest management or sustainable development, and that didn't differentiate between land which has trees on it, which we would call forestry, or is land adjacent to that forest, and land which is clearly nothing to do with forest. Therefore, somebody could manage that forest for sustainable development purposes rather than sustainable forest management purposes. And what we've seen in the past is that huge areas of forest were cleared for wind farms on the public estate. Now, this appears to give Scottish ministers, whoever manages the National Forest Estate, the potential to say, actually, I can earn more money by doing all these other things other than having trees. So I'm basically going to, in time, just going to clear all the trees away. That's that kind of lack of clarity or safety nets, which for us are very concerning.
So there's an ambiguity really in what the sections of the land are set aside for, really, and how they're going to be managed. In section 10B, it does mention other land and forestry land. So given what you've said, it's not actually clear what sections of land are other land or forestry land or land for trees, if you like, and it's...
Yeah, what you've set out there is the same head-scratching approach that we've had over the last week.
So would you like to see more clarity over what the land is actually set aside for?
I think what we've said in our submission eventually is that we think it would make a lot of sense and be very helpful, rather than describing all land as forestry land, even if it's an active farm, that just because it's owned or managed by the Scottish ministers through the Forestry and Land Scotland, as it will become, but instead that you define forestry land as actually forestry land and land associated with a forest unit. And if it's land which is not associated with forestry, that it's other land. And then you can apply, for example, sustainable development practices to land which is not forestry. And our second guessing of government, and it's always a danger to second guess, government, is that there are the provisions elsewhere in this part for land to be purchased for the purposes of sustainable development, which in themselves have no relationship to forestry. So it appears to me as though you've got two parallel strands. Well, would it not make it simpler that where you're talking about sustainable development activity, it doesn't relate to forestry, where it is forestry, it relates to sustainable forest management, and then we'd understand what on earth is happening or could happen.
Oh, sorry, Hamish.
Well, I'm quite keen to bring Claudia in as well. So, I mean, maybe I'll take one more. So, Ian was first, and then I'm going to bring Claudia in.
So it's a very short point, actually. It was really, there's a linking point here, which is about forestry, basically, as we all understand, being a long-term business. And what the Forestry Commission has achieved over the last 100 years, it has been a result of the sort of arm's length working of the Forestry Commission, having a buffer between the politicians and the Forestry Commission, which has facilitated its long-term role and which has been fantastic for forestry. And linking to the ambiguity on whether the land is to be managed for forestry or other things is the issue of direct ministerial control and whether a structure that buffered that and sort of didn't allow political expediency to have a huge impact on forestry would perhaps be a worthwhile thing to consider. I don't know.
Claudia, would you like to come in at this
Well,
stage?
that's kind of your convener.